Hello and welcome to a cute little discussion thing, kind of off the cuff. I am Colin, and I am joined by...
Oh, that's my cue. André,
Yeah, that's your cue.
André from GameXplain.
That's right. The current situation has brought together the most ambitious crossover in Nintendo YouTubers. This is finally the Source Gaming GameXplain crossover we've all been waiting for.
Finally happened. We finally made it happen.
Outside of that time, John was on Good Morning Source Gaming, but doesn't count.
Yeah, no, we don't count that.
So, this is a cute little fun idea. This wasn't really spurred on by anything in particular, no rumors or anything, but I was just kind of sitting back and just hanging back, chilling, and I was kind of thinking to myself, we're probably going to see a Nintendo 64 online service come to Switch within the next year or so.
That's a hope.
And yeah, it's a safe bet considering what we've seen with NES and SNES. And I decided it might be cute to not just make a video about what games we would like to see come to the service, because that's easy. We could just sit here all day and list like all 264 games and be like, yeah, I want to see whatever WWE game. So I decided to bring André on here, and we decided to make our own N64 online service launch lineup lists based on our own criterias. These aren't not so much wish lists, but they're more kind of guesstimates as to what we could possibly see. Though I guess we can both explain our reasonings behind why we chose each game and all that kind of fun stuff. In fact, if you would like to start with any kind of preliminary, just kind of like thoughts you had going into this behind, your general selection of games.
Yeah.
Is there any... Yeah.
I mean, it was... let me just say, first off, it was tough narrowing this down, because I know the N64 gets a lot of crap for, like, not having a great selection of games, but I feel like it had quite a few good games. I own more than 30 myself, and they're...
Yeah, it's a console that, I mean, nowadays people will be like, oh, like every game looks ugly. I don't like the controller. If you lived in Europe, every game ran at like 10 FPS.
Oh God.
Like there's certainly some issues with the N64, but all in all, it's like if you really like kind of focus in on it, like it is a pretty good console. It just had a lot of pitfalls, like having to square up with the PlayStation. And in Europe and Japan, the Sega Saturn, where it just got demolished by those two consoles.
Right.
But it's still a really good... in my opinion, I just think it has a really great library of games. And, it would be easy for us to sit here and just say every Nintendo first-party game. Because the funny thing is that despite the fact that not a lot of people are super crazy about the N64 nowadays, that's the console that has, like, the franchise-defining installments of all of these Nintendo series, or in some cases the first, like with Smash Brothers.
That's exactly it. That's what makes the 64 partially so interesting. Like, it was actually a pretty it was a time of experimentation for both Nintendo and third parties in general. Like the third dimension is pretty much entirely new. Mario 64 is what really kind of like showed what you can do in that in that 3D space, and we saw developers like taking and learning lessons as they went through that generation. And in many cases, like those games defined how the series would be. Zelda, Ocarina of Time, of course, set the template for decades to come. It was only with Breath of the Wild that then finally started reinvented again. Mario 64, of course, we still like Mario Odyssey again, like Breath of the Wild, or actually a little bit differently. Mario Odyssey kind of went back to what Mario 64 was doing originally. So we're still seeing that. We're still seeing like shockwaves from 20 years ago reverberating to this day. And then in other games cases, like we saw unique games perhaps that we haven't seen quite that ilk since then. So it kind of So I built, especially when it came to third parties, so I kind of built my list in a few different ways. One, I split it up evenly between first and third parties, which was very difficult. But I wanted to represent like what that system was, because especially at that time, we would go often months between first-party releases, and you'd be playing third-party games to kind of fill in those gaps. And they're not all great, but they were fun and unique at the time. And they may not all hold up these days, but it was we had an eclectic mix of games back then. I wanted to represent that here. Furthermore, the N64 was the fun machine. That's what it was called. That's what its tagline was, at least in America. I don't know if it was worldwide. Because it had 4 controller ports, and so much of what that system was built around getting your friends together, having a great time, just partying, Mario partying, and playing all kinds of multiplayer games. So I definitely tried to inform my list based on that as well. So I wanted to have a fair amount of multiplayer games in there, both first and third party, as well as get some some more unique games from third parties in particular that may not be often represented otherwise, or that we haven't even seen since in some cases.
Yeah, I did sort of a similar thing. That will be how we present our lists. Is we'll start with first party games and then go into third-party games, because they technically are their own category. Though there is sort of a middle gray area with your various second-party developers. I won't name any names, but I think most people know who I'm referring to. But I did, in fact, myself set some rules, some kind of obvious rules, but I just, I kind of want to put them out there anyway. Number 1, no licensed games. I know that probably goes without saying, but it is a situation where I just don't see anything licensed because the copyrights and all the publisher issues with those are all over the place. So yeah, that means stuff like GoldenEye or Star Wars, and this will hurt, I think, a lot of people, any wrestling games that just will have to be omitted, which is a shame, because those are all classics. That's actually kind of the thing that is making... we had to compile a list of 20 games, because that just seems to be the general go-to launch lineup for these online services. But I think you can make a top 50, and you'd still have to cut some fan favorites. Mm-hmm. But yeah, those are off the table, and anything with a re-release or remaster or port that is objectively better than the original, to the point where having the original would just kind of seem make no sense. So in that situation, stuff like Turok 1 and 2 or Doom 64 would be omitted, because they're already on Switch, and those versions of the games are way better than their original releases. And the mindset I went with into mine is I definitely wanted to have a good combination of good single player and good multiplayer, but I also didn't want to make my list so much a collection of the 20 best Nintendo 64 games, because I feel like that's a little too easy, and also leads to very subjective and biased choices. But I wanted to make a list of must-plays, a list of games with big names, big clout, and even if some of these games you've never heard before or you've never played before, the idea is that you'd be able to pick them up and go, oh wow, this is kind of amazing, and this holds up amazingly well. Mm-hmm. So that's how I picked my lineup. And so what we're gonna do is I'll list my first party choices, and then you'll list your first party choices, and along the way we can kind of compare and contrast why we chose our games and such, and then we'll move over to the third party stuff.
Okay, sounds good to me.
I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but I did a 12-8 split between first party and third party, though 2 of those 12 are kind of that second party middle ground, so we'll get into there. So let me start listing my games, and there's, quite a few obvious ones I don't think we'll need to explain. Super Mario 64. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You asked me there.
Yeah, it's just come on. Zelda Ocarina of Time.
Duh.
Obviously. Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64. I don't think anyone's complaining about any of those. Mm-hmm. Those are, they just make sense. They're genuine staples of the system. Here comes the controversial picks, or at least just the slightly out there ones. So, Wave Race 64.
Is that controversial?
I think a lot of people would be... when I think of Wave Race 64, it's certainly not a huge banger of a title on the N64. It's a great game, but it certainly doesn't have the same pull as a Mario or a Zelda.
That's true, yeah.
But I don't know a single person who owns an N64 who doesn't own Wave Race 64.
Right.
You know what I mean? Then we have Mario Party 2.
Okay.
It seems like Nintendo likes 2 more than the other two N64 Mario Parties.
Well, yeah, that was the first Mario Party that didn't destroy your hand with those control stick spinning games.
And I think it's the only Mario Party on the Virtual Console.
Yeah, I don't know why
they
keep ignoring 3 when there's no reasons for that I'm aware of, but...
It's very odd. But, yep, there's Mario Party 2. I chose Mario Golf, but I omitted Mario Tennis, because we just haven't seen Mario Golf in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yoshi's Story, Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards.
That's a good one.
And then 1080-degree snowboarding.
Ooh, that's a fun one.
Mm-hmm. And that series needs to come back soon.
It hasn't seen it since the GameCube, yeah.
Yeah, really. And then for my 2 kind of second-party, technically could be considered third-party, but they're published by Nintendo, and they're technically kind of Nintendo franchises, we have Cruisin' USA and Mischief Makers.
Ooh, Mischief Maker. That's one I never played. The only part I ever saw was when I think they showed a snippet of it at the end of one of those VHS tapes Nintendo used to send out, maybe Star Fox, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember it looking cool. It was like one of the few 2D games on the system.
It's definitely a cult classic of an N64 game. Now, I want to explain not just my picks, if I have to really explain most of them, because I think most people just be like, yeah, whatever. But there are a few notable omissions, and I just kind of want to go over why I didn't include those.
Okay.
Zelda Majora's Mask.
Ooh.
I did not include Majora's Mask, and the reason being is because when NES Online launched, they only included Legend of Zelda, but not Zelda 2. On top of that, I generally just want to have a focus on sort of a more diverse lineup. I don't want to have too many games that are samey from each other. And Majora's Mask is like... I mean, it's a great game, but it's also the definition of, like, it's basically an expansion pack.
Oh, that's...
So I think... Yeah.
No, that's so interesting because I mean you're not wrong. Like the core fundamentals are obviously like, Ocarina of Time, but yeah, everything surrounding that though is so different and unique that Majora's Mask is such a weird case because the core assets and gameplay are very similar, but the way the wrapping around is so very different from anything we'd really seen of Zelda up to that point, or even since.
Yeah, and again, I would have to stress that just because I'm omitting a game doesn't mean I dislike the game, or I don't think it would be likely to come to the service. If anything, there's a good chance that if I'm omitting a game, it's because I think it'll come later, because kind of the beauty of N64 Online, or all these classic online services, is that they can be updated. Problem being, is Nintendo doing a good job of that? And the answer is not necessarily. They need to get on top of that a little bit more. I also didn't include Pilot Wings, because despite the fact that Pilot Wings is on SNES Online, supposedly, according to a Shadow Link, go yell at him if he's wrong, apparently Nintendo and the developers of Pilot Wings 64 are not on good terms. So there is a possibility that they just wouldn't. I don't know if that's totally 100% accurate, but you know, that's out there. And then I think what is probably the biggest omission as far as first party stuff goes would be Paper Mario 64. And that, again, I think just comes down to, at least for me, it's with this list, like, I think it would be kind of silly for Nintendo to roll out all of the big heavy hitters all at once. And Paper Mario seems like it would be definitely better suited for later down the line as sort of like a, whoa, like, here's a reason to go back and open up N64 Online and you know, play another game.
Yeah, there's a good case to be made for that, for sure.
It's a very... Because Paper Mario is... I mean, it's an RPG. It's a long game. So they don't want to overshadow all of these other potentially much shorter games, or even these, like, multiplayer-focused stuff with Paper Mario. And I think the same can also be said for the first Smash Brothers. Multiplayer classic, but with Ultimate as strong as it is, might make sense to kind of hold it off until later.
Mm-hmm. I didn't even consider that for my list. So now I'm rethinking things. But there's a good argument to make for them like doling out slowly over time as they already have.
Yeah.
For the previous services.
But the cool thing about this discussion is that I could be totally wrong. So
that's true.
So
yeah.
All right. So now it's time for your list.
All right. So, I split my list as evenly as possible between first and third party releases. So it's 10 and 10. Although, when we get to the third party section, we've actually already touched on a couple because it depends how you look at it. Some of these games are arguably first party or second party.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's where it gets a little bit tricky. But I'll stick to the purely first party ones for now, or at least as far as I'm aware, first party. So the ones I have starting off are Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time because obviously you need those there. There's no way the service launches without both. They're two pillar, two other iconic 64 titles. There's no way, not a chance in hell.
Yeah.
Moving on, I have Pilotwings 64, but I think there is a chance this actually could appear because this is the other launch title, the only other launch title Nintendo had in the United States.
Yeah, that is like I think the strongest argument for that is that for the longest time, if you had an N64 at launch, there was only 2 games to play at like
exactly. Yeah, and that was a great game too. I thoroughly love that game. For as fun as Pilotwings Resort is, it's not Pilotwings 64, and it's another great early look at 3D, and how it works. And I think it's just a good way of showing off the N64 era. And we haven't had a re-release since. So hope that applies to most of these games, obviously.
Yeah.
But now my next one, which is Majora's Mask. I feel like this game is so different from most other Zeldas. We have to have it here, especially because even though it has been re-released on 3DS, and some might consider it to be the superior one, I don't, and I think the original is different enough that it warrants being re-released its own. Now it has, to be fair, it has been re-released already a few times, including on Wii Virtual Console, and I think it was also on a GameCube disc, that compilation Zelda disc.
It was, but it's not
a good
version.
Yeah, exactly.
Version of the game.
Yeah, the Wii version was quite a bit better, just because it ran better.
They nailed down that emulation a lot better.
Exactly. So I would love to see that here. Moving on, I'm gonna reorder my list slightly here in live action. I'm going with Mario Party 3. I think you had Mario Party 2 on your list, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going with Mario Party 3 just because we haven't seen it. I don't think we've seen it re-released since. Nintendo, for some reason, just loves Mario Party 2. And while that game might be better, I've gone back to Mario Party 3 recently, and I forgot how good that game is because I kind of ignored it at the time. I feel like maybe a lot of people did because it came out at the tail end of the 64 era. I think people were kind of burning out Mario Party at that time because this is the third year in a row we got one.
I would actually totally 100% agree. I think 3 is a little bit better than 2. At least I think it's more that 3 has like better balance. 2 is almost like a Wild West. I mean, no pun intended because there's a Wild West map.
Exactly.
But like the balance in that game is so dickish towards other people.
It definitely could be.
It seems like the stakes are both higher and lower in Mario Party 3. It's like an overall much better experience.
Yeah, I think it's overall more refined. You can hold more items in your inventory, so that's a little bit more strategy. The only thing is I probably like the maps, the boards a little bit better in 2, but I think 3 might actually be the overall better experience. And what was really fun for me was going back to it, and I think for a lot of people going back to it now, is because I myself kind of did skip at the time. All those minigames were new to me, so it was kind of like having a classic Mario, classic style Mario Party, which we've barely had. They only started touching upon it recently with Super Mario Party again. Yeah. And it was kind of cool to be able to revisit a game that I didn't know much about. I'm like, oh, these minigames are all new.
Mario Party 2 is kind of like a good Mario Party 1, and then Mario Party 3 feels like a real, sequel.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it. That's exactly it. Mario Party 3 was like a refinement of 2. When 2, kind of figured out how to make 1 work better. Yeah. But although I loved Mario Party 1 at the time, that game that's a hard game to go back to, especially with
fine. It's just you don't want to drill a hole in your hand. Yeah.
Exactly. Ideally not. All right, moving on. This is gonna be a bit controversial because I don't have Mario Kart 64 on my list, and I did that because I have a few other racers on here, and Mario Kart 64 for me, that's a hard game to go back to. It's been pretty much eclipsed by the subsequent Mario Karts. Like if you have Mario Kart Deluxe, especially with it having a battle mode, which, to be fair, isn't Mario Kart 64's battle mode, but in terms of especially racing, 8 Deluxe is just a far better experience. Mario Kart 64 is just a rough experience to go back to.
Yeah.
So I omitted that. In its place, I have Excite Bike 64, a game.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. that has to be one of my favorite games of that era, in terms of racing at least. And it's a style of game I feel like we haven't really seen much of since.
No, we haven't. We haven't seen anything from Excite since Truck on the Wii,
or Bots, I guess technically. But that was a game ignored by most everyone.
Yeah.
So Excite Truck would probably be the closest comparison that people actually played. So yeah, Excite Bike 64 had such tight controls. It had multiple game modes, including a 3D version of the original Excite Bike. It even had the original Excite Bike in there. It had a full 3D course editor. It had an amazing desert mode. You could just explore this never-ending landscape forever. I could go on and on. There's tons of stuff to do in that game. It had an amazing 4-player mode. It basically had an early version of I'm drawing a blank, that soccer game that you race in cars. Why can't I think of it?
Rocket League.
Rocket League, thank you. It had basically that in the game, but with motorbikes instead. So it has so many modes. I think it'd be a perfect representation for a fun machine where you could play with your friends in multiplayer and just have a blast. And speaking of the fun machine, I did base my list around multiplayer heavily, which is why I'm also including Dr. Mario 64. Literally the only 4-player version of Dr. Mario that exists. There's no other game from it, even though we've seen multiple Dr. Mario since, no others that I'm aware of have been 4 players. I want a 4-player Dr. Mario.
There is a glaring flaw with my list, and that is a lack of puzzle games. That includes, I did not include, what is it called? The new Tetris?
The new Tetris,
which was, I think, a Japanese exclusive title, even though it doesn't really matter. But in regards to that, I only didn't include Tetris because of Tetris 99. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I didn't consider that for my list.
And even then, the licensing for Tetris is weird.
Yeah, that's where things
Very
get
weird.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, because we haven't even seen the the Dr. Mario Tetris crossover, I think, that was on Super Nintendo on the Super NES app yet either.
Is NES Tetris even on NES
I don't
online?
think so.
Yeah,
No,
I don't think so.
Yeah, so that is a good point. So my list might be quickly dated here, but we'll go. That'll be in the third-party section.
Yeah, yeah.
Moving on, I do have Paper Mario here. Although I agree with your logic that they may hold back on some of the big first-party adventure type games.
Yeah, long experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, but it may not. They could do that for one of the Zeldas, for instance. I'll put Paper Mario on mine, but I think that's something to show up at some point at the least. And of course, in this day and age, people are really clamoring for that classic Paper Mario experience, and what better way to deliver that than with the original Paper Mario?
Yeah,
the one that started it all. And yeah, that game's just so fun to go back to. I still think it holds up.
Oh, it's a fantastic game. It's probably the swan song of the N64.
Yeah, it basically was. I think it was one of the last, if not the last, big first-party titles. Maybe excepting Mario Party 3, although I think that game might have even preceded it.
It came out in February 2000, so yeah.
Yeah, the 64 or the GameCube was basically already out or going to be out soon. Later that year.
Yeah.
Yeah, then there was a big gap. I think actually the only other big title, which wasn't first party technically, after Paper Mario was Conker's Bad Fur Day, which came out a couple months later, and that was published by Rare though, and not Nintendo because of how adult it was. Nintendo wanted nothing to do with it.
And of course, the last game on the N64 was Tony Hawk, which I would love to have on this list, but that goes into the whole license thing. And
exactly. All right, and then I'll wrap up my list with 2 other racers because for some reason racers were a big thing back on the 64.
Yes, they were.
And I'm ending with Wave Race and F-Zero X. F-Zero X, just because I think it's about time we see more F-Zero, and even if it's not a new one, I'll take it in whatever form I can get it. And F-Zero X started the 3D, started and almost ended the 3D F-Zeros.
Yeah.
And what would be really cool too is one thing they could do that would be really neat is if they could follow in the veins of Star Fox 2 being re-released, both now on the Super NES Classic, but also the Nintendo Switch Online app, is they could add content that wasn't there before, because there is also the 64 DD expansion, disc drive, where you could create your own F-Zero tracks. And I would love if they brought that over for the US release and let us make our own and incorporate that and give us actual new content. And then Wave Race, I just love that game. That game's super fun. And it was it wasn't a launch title, but it was pretty close, and it'd be great to have it here too.
I think it's very early 97, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I believe you're right. So
I mean, Wave Race, it really is the staple. I even remember going to my dentist as a kid, and they had the N64 kiosk with just Wave Race,
right,
because it's such an easy pick up and play.
And in a technology sense, that game looked amazing at the time. Like, I feel like maybe I'm looking back with rose tinted glasses, but I can still play that game and still be impressed by the water effects.
Yeah,
Even though they're obviously dated, but they still look. There's something still appealing about them.
It's interesting you paired Wave Race and F-Zero because they're both like very interesting like technical achievements on the N64. Because Wave Race, of course, has like this like crazy in-depth water effect. Go watch the Digital Foundry video on water effects in video games. Like they go like crazy about how that stuff works. And F-Zero is most famous for running at a locked 60 FPS on the N64. Like it's buttery smooth
with 30 erasers on the screen at the same
really.
time.
It's crazy.
And I think, was it still 60 frames per second even in 4-player too?
It probably
I don't remember.
dipped, but I think it was stable for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, and we really can't understate that. Like, no games ran at 60 frames per second during the 3D era.
Yeah.
I mean, they had during the 16-bit, like 8-bit, 16-bit eras, but during the 3D era, everything was 30. Except here comes F-Zero, and I think I don't even know if I was able to appreciate it, at least cautiously at the time, like what that meant. But that game was buttery smooth, and that's why.
It definitely helps that game give speediness that F-Zero from that point on would be, most known for.
And it's probably
2-3 games going forward after that point.
Yeah. And it's for that reason too that game might actually hold up better than some of these others because it will just feel so smooth going back to. I mean, that's a faster frame rate than most modern games even.
Yeah, really.
So, yeah.
But
all right, so go ahead.
That's our first party.
Yep.
That is our first party list. Now, we sort of, as I said earlier, we were going to kind of breeze through the first party stuff because there is a lot of stuff we agree upon. But this is where the real, this is where we separate the men from the boys. Because I think, I would not be surprised if our choices for third-party games are wildly different.
Watch it end up being identical.
Oh, that'd be weird. That'd be very funny.
Yeah, that'd be very bizarre.
Cute. Here we go. So, right off the bat, for my third-party games, I think it would be very important for Nintendo to lock down, similar to how it is important, or at least it's very cool, when Nintendo locks down third-party AAA support for the Nintendo Switch. I think it would be equally cool to make sure that some of the big heavy hitters of the 1990s would also be on N64 Online. And the reason why I say that is because the N64, in terms of power, was no slouch. And for a while, it was basically on par with the gaming, PCs of the day. Not for long. Yeah. Obviously, Half-Life couldn't run on an N64. But, 96, 97, 98, you were seeing stuff like Turok and GoldenEye that was really, squaring up with whatever you could run on a gaming PC. And I wanted to focus on that. I wanted to make sure that we have a handful of third-party games on this list that, again, it might seem a little odd at first because they're the N64 versions, but the N64 versions of these games are widely known to be very good versions of these games, and honestly, I think they would be super killer to have on the service. So first off, we have Quake from id Software.
Ooh.
Now, this is a really interesting pick for a couple of reasons. One, Quake is just hands down one of the best shooters of all time. It's just a fantastic game. And the N64 version, when you compare it to, the Saturn version, and I don't even think there was a PS1 version of Quake 1, but compared to other console versions of Quake, the N64 version was about as faithful as you could get. It runs beautifully. It looks like Quake. Basically, the entire level set from the PC version is there. I think the only difference is that it's not split up into episodes. It's just kind of one long 30-something level campaign. It has split-screen multiplayer, so you can have your nice, two-player split-screen first-person shooter deathmatching. Fully customizable controls and graphical options, which I think are actually very important, not just, as a quality of life feature on the original game and console itself, but for playing these games nowadays, which means you can find, you'd be able to fully remap Quake's controls to the Joy-Cons for that nice twin-stick feel. But I think the thing that actually makes Quake a very viable and sensible choice for N64 Online is that all of the music Quite famously, Nine Inch Nails' own Trent Reznor did the music and sound design for Quake. But for the console version, all the music was redone by Aubrey Hodges, who did the music for Doom 64 and the PlayStation Doom ports. And any reference to Nine Inch Nails, including the logos on the nail gun ammo, were completely replaced with just generic textures. So Quake 64 wouldn't just be a really cool, it would be both a really cool kind of select to have on there, because Quake is just a big name title, but also I actually think Bethesda would probably be cooler with putting the Quake N64 port than going through the trouble of dealing with all the licensing issues of actually porting Quake to modern consoles, as sad as that is. Mm-hmm. So that's Quake. After that, we have Resident Evil 2, aka the definitive version of that game.
Yes, I agree with you.
Because, again, even though it has the compressed cutscenes and the compressed music, it also has, 4 or 5 different control options. The backgrounds were and the models were of a much higher quality than on the PlayStation, and even the PC version. And
yeah, it had a high-res mode, too, didn't it? Because of the expansion
pack. And the N64's really good texture filtering meant the game just looked it's sublime. And considering how stingy Capcom has been with releasing newer Resident Evil games on the Switch, with both releasing the older games for way more than they should cost, and the likelihood of RE3 Remake coming as a cloud game, I think they don't seem like they're going to intend on re-releasing RE2 Classic or even RE3 Classic anytime soon. So I feel like it would just make sense to let this online service have what is essentially the best version of this survival horror classic.
That'd be cool. Yeah, I'm right there with you. Especially because I wasn't a huge fan of the original controls, but this game let you play it as if it was more like Mario or something, for a better word. Where you pressed up, your character moves up in that direction rather than relative to themselves. They got rid of the tank controls, which I really liked.
It does what the remake does, where you can have those kind of any direction you want movement on the analog stick, but you still have tank controls on the D-pad, which is perfect. Mm-hmm. It's wouldn't have it any other way. And for my third big quote-unquote AAA third-party release, StarCraft 64.
Ooh, interesting.
A strange, almost pseudo remake of the PC classic for the N64, because they basically had to redesign how that game functions to make it work on console. And they even included a split-screen multiplayer mode, which would be very cool to have.
Yeah.
And then after that, for the rest of my third-party stuff, we have a couple of games from Konami. We have Mystical Ninja with Goemon, which is it's just a classic. And then we have a little bit of a weird choice. So there's this game called Rakuga Kids. And this is my, as you kind of said before, how Nintendo likes to sometimes drop sort of an unreleased or just very, very obscure kind of region-locked thing onto their services. We've had Star Fox 2, but the name escapes me, but we've definitely had a few games that were never released in the US come over to the US service, either with new translations or just translations that were in the works and then just, never were done anything with. Rakuga Kids is a fighting game with an art style that's very similar to Parappa the Rapper, and it was only released in Japan and Europe, and since it was released in Europe, it means that it's technically fully translated in English. And this is probably the most biased choice on this entire list for me, because I just think generally that game is really cool and really unique, and I think it would be... not many people would immediately latch onto it, but I think once they pick it up and play it, they'd be like, oh, this is kind of dope. And then for the last two, we have Harvest Moon 64.
Oh, that's a good one. I didn't even think about that one.
And then, last but not least, we have, because it was inevitable, a game from Rare. And that game is, drumroll please, Blast Corps.
Yes. Blast
So
Core.
I chose Blast Core. This I think to a lot of people they're gonna go, really? That's the Rare game, not anything else? And my reasoning for this is, if we do in fact live in the perfect timeline where Microsoft, Rare, and Nintendo are all buddy again, I don't want any of the games on Rare Replay on N64 Online. I would rather get Rare Replay, or at the very least, the versions of those games from Rare Replay. As I said before, I don't want games that have re-releases and ports that are objectively better. And if Nintendo and Rare and Microsoft are that buddy-buddy, I would much rather have the Xbox 360 versions of Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, and Perfect Dark. I don't want to play the original N64 versions at that point. If the possibility is there, right, I'd rather have the better versions. And then you have games like Jet Force Gemini, which, no, I don't really like that game. That's, again, biased choice, but whatever.
I liked it at the time, but it doesn't really
does not. And then, last but not least, there's Conker. And Conker, I think, is that one makes sense, too, to have on the service, but it's also, like, I mean, we already have a couple M-rated games on here with Quake and Resident Evil 2, and, of course, we then have to go into the issue of how do you put M-rated games on the service that's meant for everyone, unless you fiddle about with, like, the parental controls and all that. But Conker is, like, the hardest M rating of like, any N64 game, and as much as I would like to see it, again, it's on Rare Replay. I think it would make more sense if we're ever actually at that point for it to just have its own release separate from the online service.
Oh yeah, there's no way it appears on Nintendo Switch Online.
And conveniently, Blast Core, not on Rare Replay.
Well, there we go.
Yeah.
I think it was meant to be then. Yeah, this is this chance.
I guess same thing with Killer Instinct, because Killer Instinct has the arcade versions included with Rare Replay, and those versions are way better. Way better than their console versions.
Although Killer Instinct Gold was a little unique in that, they replaced the pre-rendered backgrounds with 3D versions, which objectively look worse, but they are a bit different, from the original.
They are neato.
Yeah, so Killer Instinct Gold would be interesting, but I didn't even think about it.
Yeah, I think I'd rather want Rare Replay in this perfect scenario that Rare is cool with all this stuff, because I feel like people I can imagine some people would just be upset if I just didn't have a Rare game on here, but I think in this perfect timeline scenario, I would not want any of the Rare Replay stuff separate from Rare Replay.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, originally I had, well, I don't want to move on too much, but I originally had Banjo-Kazooie on my list. I'm like, why? It's already on Xbox. It's the better version. Yeah. And that's even more the case for Banjo-Tooie, which ran like complete crap on 64. Yeah,
exactly.
So.
And Perfect Dark, too. Perfect Dark on the 60, I love that game. It's like one of my favorites, but oh man, like the 360 version is like a perfect 60 FPS at all times. And it's,
yeah, which is fitting.
2 analog sticks, like it's perfect. Like you don't...
Yeah. It has online or LAN capabilities. Yeah, there's no going back. Yeah, you can't go back to the 64 version after that. Really. So they'd be better off just bringing that entire game over to the Switch if they wanted to do such.
Yeah, which, so. Considering that they're N64 games that were running on an Xbox 360 and the Switch is exponentially more powerful than both of those things, it wouldn't be an issue, but that's another discussion for another time.
Right.
So... let's move on to your list.
All right. Well, I'm happy to say there isn't much crossover, luckily. So, all right. So, again, there's going to be some picks in here that are arguably first party. And this first one is a little interesting because it is and it isn't. So, number one for the third parties is Cruisin' USA.
This was a crossover. This was I did have Cruisin'.
Yeah, it's. Yeah, this is a big. Oh, sorry, you didn't.
I did.
You did.
Yeah.
You did. Yeah, that's right. I thought you did. Yeah. I don't want to dwell on it too much then, but this was a big game at the time. Like this was basically how they announced the N64. But every time you play Cruisin' USA,
Cruisin' and Killer Instinct, because the arcade versions were supposedly running on Ultra 64 hardware, which ended up not being true in the slightest. But not even close. Yeah, it's close.
Yeah, if you go back and find like a Cruisin' USA game in the arcades, you'll see it on the title screen or as it cycles through the idle screen, the Ultra 64 logo pops up back when it was still Ultra 64. So seeing a console game on running on the 64, even if it did look worse and probably ran worse, it was still amazing at the time. Even if you couldn't run over Yeah, even though they did technically censor it because it couldn't like hit animals, for instance, which in hindsight is probably ahead of its time cutting that. But yeah, no, I think that was just a fun game. It was impressive at the time, like going through these real world locations. Even if like after living in San Francisco for 10 years, I'm like, this San Francisco doesn't really quite quite match up with a real life location. It was still cool at the time, and it would be fun to go back to. While on the topic of racing games, we'll get to another one of my arguably, in that weird first third-party limbo area, being Diddy Kong Racing. This game, I mean, I already mentioned I have Mario Kart 64 on my list, and especially if we have Diddy Kong Racing here, you don't need Mario Kart. Diddy Kong Racing was a better version of Mario Kart 64, fully 3D or fully polygonal characters instead of sprites. Expansive environments by comparison. You had multiple vehicles to race as. It was a great multiplayer game, and I think it still holds up because how many story-based like single-player racing games with a single-player component have we had since then? I think it's Diddy Kong Racing and like Crash Team Racing, and that's basically it.
And Diddy Kong Racing has 12 Tails Conker in it.
It does?
Yeah.
Good
it's got
point.
The original Conker.
Yeah, we also have Tip Top. Oh, go ahead.
I try to avoid. So I omitted DK64 and Diddy Kong Racing, and that's because those games also had the same weird licensing scrutiny on the Wii Virtual Console. Not that they didn't get released; it just took like forever for them to get released. I think DK64 ended up being released on the Wii U, but not the Wii. I
believe you're right. But yeah, I omitted DK64 because it's not a very good game.
Well, I also admitted DK64 because, and this one's absolutely true, and not me being blind at all. DKC Country is not on SNES.
Good point. Yeah, that's also a valid point, which I don't understand. I don't get that.
Yeah, I don't.
Especially with it being Donkey Kong Country's 25th anniversary just a few months ago, it's really a bummer that they didn't get it on there. But and then then on the Wii they even ignored DKC too. So which I never understand.
It's very odd.
Well, since we're on the topic of racing games, my next pick is also in a weird little middle ground kind of, being Ridge Racer 64.
I had actually thought of adding Ridge Racer, but I was like, cruising.
Yeah,
but you seem to be going all in on the racers. So.
Like I said, I gotta represent that era, right? So Ridge Racer 64 is unique because that was very much like it felt like a PlayStation exclusive. So having it come to Nintendo was pretty wild. But the interesting thing was
made by Nintendo.
It was made by Nintendo. It was made by NSD back when they actually made games that people wanted to play instead of Mario vs. Donkey Kong over and over. So yeah, this is technically first party, but it's a third party IP, so it's kind of a weird middle ground, but I would love to see it represented here. It technically was re-released already on the DS, I believe, but I think it'd be fun to get the N64 original on this service if it ever comes to Switch.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving
on, here's an unusual one. Fully third party, being Rocket Robot on Wheels. Because I think this is of course a collectathon, 3D collectathon, and I think it's good to represent that, because this is the era of those collectathons. We had Rayman 2, which now I'm thinking, why is Rayman 2 on my list? Crap. Should be here.
As I said, we could do a top 50.
We really could.
Have to admit stuff. It'd be crazy.
But Rocket Robot on Wheels is probably one of the better, if not the best, third-party collectathon games. It was made by Sucker Punch, which of course went on to make games like, Infamous. And it had a really cool, physics engine at the time. In a time before Half-Life 2, that we had a game that was built around largely physics, where you could build a roller coaster at some point, and the coaster abided by actual physics, and you had to get your coaster to the end while collecting power-ups along the way. You could throw objects around to see them bound around the environment. You could mix paint colors to create new ones. It was a really cool thing that had that used physics in a puzzler-based way. So yeah, it'd be fun to have here, especially seeing how I think this was Sucker Punch's first game, so it'd be neat to have.
Who did the publishing on that?
Oh god, I don't know offhand.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, unfortunately. Next up, something else that 64 was kind of known for was, many consider Halo to be the birth of, first-person shooters on consoles, but really the 64 started that, with GoldenEye, Turok, but also a little lesser-known one, Forsaken 64. So this game was kind of wild because it was a first-person flying game. You flew around.
Yeah, it's a 360-degree kind of
Yeah.
Like, it's almost like Descent on console.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was totally wild at the time where, you could control this motorcycle in a 3D space, like hovercraft, basically. So you had paths above and below you. It was wild. It was really easy to get turned around and get, confused with where you're at. But it was super fun, especially in multiplayer. It was basically GoldenEye, but in a fully 3D space, like fully, they can explore everywhere. And it was just completely wild. And I always loved the nuke item. You could get, just launch a nuke and just blow up everyone in a particular room. So yeah, they could bring that back. That would be fun.
I actually think Forsaken is getting a remaster.
Oh, is it? Oh man.
Yup.
Well,
by Night Dive.
had I known that, had I known
Is
that,
it
I've
out?
admitted that. If it is, I totally missed the boat on that one.
It's actually out. It's on PC though.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
It is Forsaken Remastered is out, but not on console. So there's a chance.
There's a chance, maybe. All right, moving on.
It's funny. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all good.
But it's actually one of my early choices. Speaking of multiplayer shooters, was Turok 3.
Oh yeah.
And the reason why Turok 3 isn't a great game, but Turok 1 and 2 already have remasters, and Night Dive Studios, the company behind doing the remasters and or remakes, ports, whatever, of Turok 1 and 2 and Doom 64, they have the rights to Turok, but they don't have the source code for Turok 3 because it was N64 only, whereas Turok 1 and 2 had PC ports. So they have said that they're probably never going to do a remaster of Turok 3. And so they could probably very easily allow Nintendo to just put the Turok 3 ROM on N64 Online.
Well, I've got a possibly better option if we're talking Turok. What about Rage Wars, the multiplayer-focused version of Turok?
That is true. Granted, it's Turok 2's multiplayer, but yeah, it's still a great game nonetheless. Is that on your list, or is that
No,
just
it's not.
a?
I'm just bringing it
okay.
up.
Yeah.
All right, well, moving on to my list. Back to my list. Going back to our racing game, Snowboard Kids. Another
Hell yeah!
Right, another game that I would actually consider better than Mario Kart 64, and very unique. In that I mean, as you might expect, it's a downhill racing snowboarding game, but all the environments aren't just snow focused. You're like going down hills or going through cities. I don't know, there's a bunch of different environments, but it was still fun. And like Mario Kart, it had the power-up system, but it was very unique in that you had to collect coins along the way in order to actually cash them in to buy power-ups. And there were, I think, offensive and defensive power-ups, and it was just a really fun multiplayer game. And I always lose it. It's always so fun when you reach because it had laps. But in order to, reset yourself on a lap, you had to go into a ski lift at the bottom. And you basically had to form a queue at it because there's only, it's only one ski lift at a time. So it's like kind of a race to get to that ski lift, and if someone misses it, they just ram into the wall. And while they're like trying to recover from that, someone else might snipe them and get the next ski lift. So it's just a hilarious thing that's always kind of mixing up.
Yeah, it's like a kart racing SSX. It's kind of wacky.
Yeah,
it's a good. I like it.
Yeah, I wish now, like, I love Mount Warrior and Mario Kart 8. I would love if they actually added that kind of mechanic to it where you have to get a ski lift at the bottom to take it back to the top. And that'd be great. All right, moving on. I have a couple puzzle games here. The new Tetris, which is just an amazing version of Tetris. It's the game that invented the hold block. You couldn't, couldn't, and it had a few other unique mechanics too, like forming gold and silver bricks by making squares, and it had a 4-player multiplayer game. That was just a lot of fun. And all the while, you're earning for each line you clear. You work your way toward completing these monuments or like historic, like these historic sites, like. Things from like ancient Greece or other historical structures. It was really fun to see those being built up. And once you built one, you got like a whole little cutscene of it. It was just a super cool game. So yeah, having a 4-player Tetris would be awesome, even if the Tetris license can be a bit problematic. And on that note, I also have Tetrisphere, another completely unique puzzle game. Even though it's Tetris, it's barely Tetris. It only has the Tetris pieces here. Otherwise, it's totally its own thing, where you have this 3D sphere you need to clear of blocks, and had an amazing soundtrack, which New Tetris did as well. And it had a two-player mode as well, so that'd be fun to have. Moving on, I have Body Harvest, which was one of the first, I think it might have been the first game, or one of the earliest games from DNA or DMA, I think DMA.
Yeah, it's like DMA Designs.
Yeah,
which
Rockstar
guys. Yeah.
Became Rockstar, exactly. So this was basically a proto version of Grand Theft Auto, where you had this giant kind of open world, not fully open, but open-esque. But it was a giant world. There were 5 levels, but each one was huge. And you could steal vehicles or grab vehicles and race them, or not race, but drive them around the environment. And you had to use them to solve puzzles and get around. It's just a really unique game. It had shooting mechanics that are really difficult to go back to, but so did Grand Theft Auto. So Grand Theft Auto's never had great shooting mechanics. It's kind of fitting that Body Harvests aren't good either. But yeah, it was a fun game that really that is kind of like a very expansive single player game that I think would be fun to have.
It's super ambitious, but that was also kind of its downfall. Like because they had to cut back so much of it during development.
It would honestly be hard to go back to, but I think it's also for that reason that's fun to have here as just like a set piece to show like what early 3D games were trying to do.
It's definitely like a nice little museum piece of a game.
Exactly. You can see like the DNA of Grand Theft Auto definitely in there, or the early start of it. Finally, to bring things back to it being a fun machine, I want Bomberman 64 on this virtual console service, because Bomberman 64 is my favorite Bomberman. It may only be 4-player. I say only, because there were like 10-player multiplayer games before, 10-player Bomberman games before this. But it is so freaking fun. It was basically a 3D version of Bomberman. There was like vertical height. There was elevation changes in these stages. You could pump up bombs and throw them and make these massive explosions. It just had really unique mechanics, but Bomberman standards, and I don't think any Bomberman game has really returned to them. And I would love to see that represented here, because it was such a blast. Literally.
Actually, on an earlier version of my list, I had Bomberman Hero. Because Bomberman Hero is a wholly just like unique experience. It's a Bomberman 3D platformer, but it doesn't really play like any other 3D platformer of its era. It's very kind of unique designed. And I ended up cutting it because I felt like it would be cooler if later on both Bomberman 64 and Bomberman Hero were kind of together. And as I said, I kind of wanted more of a kind of diverse genre lineup. Right. But yeah, Bomberman 64 would definitely be something I would want to see come to the service.
It's so fun.
It's one of the best multiplayer games on the system, like by far.
Yep, I agree. So yeah, that's my list. That's all 20 of them.
That's my list too. Any you want to talk about any omissions, like anything you had kind of in mind but then maybe last minute?
Yeah, I mean, so before you brought up the license angle, I actually had I had Shadows of the Empire and Rogue Squadron on my list. Shadows of the Empire primarily for its historical importance, because at the time it was amazing. The shooter levels don't really hold up, but the flying levels are still so fun. I still think, for me, at least of the games I played, that Hoth level is still my favorite Hoth level I've experienced in a game.
Fantastic.
It was so great, because it really felt like this giant battle, whereas other Hoth stages I've played feel more linear and more mission focused, and I like that this one's all about just destroy the enemies however you can, and it looked amazing at the time. But then Rogue Squadron was just a more refined game. It felt like actually a really refined version of Star Fox 64's all range mode. The entire game built around that idea, but more refined, arguably better looking, maybe not quite as well running. And it had really impressive production values. Like I think it had full speech. I guess Star Fox did as well. They had a lot of dialogue in this. It was just a really fun game. So, and
I think that was one of the first games to use the expansion pack.
Oh yeah, that's right. It had the high res mode, high res in quotes. But it did double the resolution. I think the downside was it made the frame rate worse, as I recall.
Yeah, that's like all of those games with stuff like Hybrid Heaven. You could run it at 480p, but it runs at 2 FPS. Yeah, that's not a good advantage.
Exactly.
The licensing thing is a shame, because one of the genres the N64 is most known for outside of shooters and racers is your wrestling games. But I mean, the WWE, the WWF, they are notorious with the licensing for those games being a pain. I think they did recently a plug and play with a bunch of the old NES WrestleMania games, and they went back and took character, they took people out of them and replaced them with other lesser known wrestlers at the time, just because they didn't want to bother with Hulk Hogan, and I think Roddy Piper also got cut from that plug and play. I feel like there would be way too many hands in that basket.
Yeah.
And GoldenEye, I mean, like, it's one of the biggest shames is that GoldenEye will never come back, but there are way too many hands in that soup.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think, wasn't there that leak that they were even trying to... There's footage, I think, of a GoldenEye remake, HD remake, but it just couldn't come out because of licensing issues. Yeah, because it's such a bummer. Because,
so many people would have had to be paid. It was something like Microsoft would have had to get royalties, Nintendo would have had to get royalties, Rare, and then also Activision and the James Bond company, because Activision was the one with the James Bond game licenses. And you know, the James Bond company. It's such a mess. It is like one of the most defining games of that console, and it's like it'll never see the light of day again. It is such a shame.
Such a bummer because you're right. I mean, that's one of the first games people are going to think of when they think of Nintendo 64. But so many people were playing that back in like college or high school. My high school had tournaments for it, and it was just such a blast to engage with.
Granted,
so it sucks that.
Granted, Perfect Dark is in many ways a much better game, but it's not GoldenEye. But it's also just not GoldenEye. It's not,
That's exactly it. It may be objectively better in some ways, not every way. But yeah, it came out toward the tail end of the 64, and it didn't have the zeitgeist around it that GoldenEye did. And plus, GoldenEye kind of showed how shooters could work on consoles before Halo, to the point where it even had a dual analog control scheme. If you had two controllers, so you could even play it yourself with two controllers and two joysticks.
But let's be real, the best way of playing that game is the left-handed control mode, and I will.
Oh, Turok style.
Yeah.
Left-handed. Oh no, with a D-pad and D-pad and stick.
It's so comfy. Oh, that's how I play like every shooter on the N64 now.
I was a 1.2 person myself, so I'd use the C button. I'd use Turok style.
See, that's the thing. Everyone uses the C buttons, but if you actually do the left-handed stuff, you're like, oh, this is really it's really comfy. It's like it works.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to like stick your thumb out to hit the A and B buttons, but it's not that bad because that controller was made for children.
I wonder if my friend ever played that way, because the way his hands were huge, so he would actually hold the controller from the 1 and 3 positions, with the D-pad and the buttons. Yeah. Because he would just reach his thumb over to reach the control stick. So, I wonder if he ever tried that method. But, anyways, for me, other missions would be Super Smash 64. I really wanted it here because I love the original, and I love that it's what got the series started. But on the Switch, on the platform with Smash Ultimate, it's like, how many people, we don't really need it.
Yeah.
They are different, but they're also kind of redundant in some ways.
My argument for keeping, like, Mario Kart is that Mario Kart is like one of the best-selling just franchises ever, and people just love every game in that series. Like people go crazy. I mean, like now there's kind of like a backlash towards some of the older ones because they're very dated. Like I've met quite a few people who just do not like Super Mario Kart, but I feel like between Mario Kart and Smash, I feel like having Mario Kart makes sense, but I don't think too many people would be clamoring for Smash 64.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I think you are right. There is a certain appeal to Mario Kart 64 where, like, at least for me, like, you'll still see it, like, in barcades, and people get excited. It's like, oh, I remember playing Mario Kart 64, right?
The nostalgia is much stronger for Mario Kart than there is Smash.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So, and it still probably has one of the better battle modes, which it can't for some reason get quite right in the subsequent games.
Really.
If they're not cutting it entirely. For me, I also cut, or not even cut. I never even considered Yoshi's Story. I just don't like that game. So
I shopped my list around to a few people, and they were all like, "Yoshi's Story, really?" But I don't know. Part of me's like, it's a Yoshi game. Like Nintendo will just probably put it on just for the sake of it being a Yoshi game.
I mean, You're not wrong there. I probably will end up on the service. I just don't want it.
One last game I cut that I had on for a while was Gauntlet Legends.
Oh, I don't think I played that. Was that a fighting game?
It's a dungeon crawler, kind of 4-player cooperative dungeon crawler. Very good game, very cult classic, cult favorite, but I just kind of cut it out to make room for Harvest Moon. because I thought that made
Right.
a little more sense.
Oh, I love that choice, by the way. I love Harvest Moon 64. I wish I remember to put it on my list somewhere, but that game was great.
I neglected to mention this, but I actually made a note that I did not mention. This is kind of cute, though. So I have Quake, but I have a note next to it saying that in the Japanese N64 online service, they would have Animal Forest instead of Quake.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I forgot to mention it because it's I only have the version of the list I wrote on my phone where I didn't make this note, but
Right.
it could make sense. I mean, I think it would be really cool to have N64 Animal Crossing, but I don't think they would ever actually go through the trouble of translating it.
Well, yeah, it's tough because, I mean, they did for the GameCube, but it was an enhanced version, right?
Yeah, it's technically like a remake of the game more than anything else.
And then they did re-release, I'm pretty sure they did re-release the American version in Japan on the GameCube as well.
They actually did, yeah.
So I think Nintendo themselves would consider the GameCube one the definitive one, even if it's so funny looking back because those were N64 graphics on the GameCube, but the game was so stylized enough that it didn't really matter that much, you know?
Yeah, they just had to give it like really good anti-aliasing, and you wouldn't notice.
Exactly.
Kind of Paper Mario has that same look. Like when that game has like really good anti-aliasing on it, you don't even realize it's an N64 game.
Yeah, good point. Good point. I guess for me, what else did I cut? Oh, I didn't have any Mario sports games. As much as I would love to have like Mario Tennis, because that's still my favorite, or Mario Golf on here. I feel like we've seen so many Mario sports games in general, even if we haven't had Mario Golf 2 recently.
Yeah.
That and I feel like it's probably a matter of time before we get Mario Golf. At least I hope so on Switch in some form, like if not a new one, or I mean, I would assume a new one now, but you never know. But I'm not against it, so. Being on the
Mario
Switch
Tennis has like so many like entries that I don't think we really need the 64 one, but Mario Golf is definitely also part of that bubble of just kind of like really kind of beloved of those like two Mario sports games, and we just haven't seen one in forever. So I think that would be a nice little put on there. I noticed also we both didn't put any Pokemon stuff, but I think I can assume the reason why, which is that the Pokemon company's really weird with releasing old games.
I actually had Pokemon Snap on my list for the longest time, and I cut it to make room for something else, I think. Only because it's a shorter experience, so, I'm like, oh, maybe I should put another multiplayer game. But I would love a Pokemon Snap were on this, because I love Pokemon Snap. That's my favorite Pokemon, probably my favorite Pokemon game. And I just wish we would get a sequel. So, but if not that, they should release
but with Stadium, I definitely would have put Stadium on there. But again, like it's the Pokemon company with the way they re-release their older games. Like they didn't even have any of those games on like the Virtual Console for the longest time. We had to wait forever.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
And I actually just replayed Pokemon Stadium not that long ago at a friend's place. We're playing the mini games, and those are still pretty fun.
Yeah,
they have
fantastic.
like 10 Mario Party mini games. Yeah. Good stuff. So,
but that is our list, our lists, our discussions. Let us know in the comments below how wrong we are, or at least just what games you would want to see come to the service, whether or not that be a launch title or something that would be released later on. And I want to thank Andre for joining me. It was a very cool, very calm, very clean discussion.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
As always, links down below to all of our various Twitters. Our Discord link is down there. Link to Andre's Twitter and the GameXplain YouTube channel, of course. And as always, we want to thank our patrons for always helping us out. It is sort of a tough time right now. We understand if you don't want to support, but if you do, that is the place to go. And as always, return to the source.